Are there any laws that hurt people? A woman named Linda Martin would say, yes, there is one law in particular that hurts people. Linda was born and raised in Idaho, and she was a member of a religious sect called the Followers of Christ. And this particular religious group believed that no one should use medical care. Only the prayer of faith could be used for healing. And because of that belief, large numbers of children in the families who are members of this religious sect have died from simple treatable illnesses where maybe they only needed penicillin. Linda was 16 when she left that group, but she remembers that her nephew died when he was 2 from untreated pneumonia. Many of the members of this cult did not even give their children pain reliever. They didn't get aspirin or Tylenol. They simply suffered while the elders prayed. There was another 10-year-old boy in her extended family that died from untreated diabetes. The parents are not prosecuted for the deaths of their children because of religious shield laws. These laws were passed by all 50 states during the Nixon administration because there was a catch in the law that said, if you don't include this religious shield law so parents can make decisions about the well-being of their own children, your state won't get money for child protection. Those laws are being repealed state by state by state as cases come to court. And Linda Martin is one of the forces behind the governor looking at this statute in Idaho. For the members of the Followers of Christ, the child mortality rate is 10 times greater than the child mortality rate for the entire state of Idaho. Are there laws that hurt people? Yes, there are. Is it important to break the law when the well-being of a person is placed before you? That is exactly what our reading is about this morning. Now, we are in Mark's Gospel, and I want you to remember a little bit about Mark's Gospel. It is the oldest Gospel, the shortest Gospel. I want to read one in a hurry on a rainy afternoon, maybe today. Mark is the one for you. And for Mark, everything happens immediately at once. There's a sense of urgency in this gospel. And so here we are in chapter 2 and just the beginning of chapter 3, and already Jesus has made people mad and they're looking at ways to kill him. Now, just to compare, in Matthew's gospel, chapter 2, the wise men are coming to see the baby Jesus. And in Luke's gospel, chapter 2, Jesus is just being born. And in John's gospel, chapter 2, Jesus is turning water into wine and saying, "It is not yet my time." Mark wastes no time. Mark has everything happen immediately. And we have this sense of urgency, and we have the foreshadowing of where we're going to end up. We're going to end up at the execution of Jesus, and we know it from the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. Now, when I read the scripture, I'm always trying to find what doesn't make sense. What doesn't add up? Where do I need to spend a little extra time thinking about this? And when I got into this reading this past week, I just found so many issues. I didn't know where to start. So we're just going to cover a few of the issues that I found in this reading so that we have a better idea of what's happening. We have Jesus and his disciples in a grain field on the Sabbath. And as they walk along, the disciples are pulling the heads of grain off the stalks. It does not say they're hungry, and it does not say they eat the grain. If you think that they're hungry and they ate the grain, you're thinking of Matthew's gospel, which was written much later. But Mark does not include those details. It's just the act of pulling the grain off that stalk. And the Pharisees complain and say, hey, wait a minute, there's a law, and your disciples are breaking the law. Now, the first problem, according to scholar Michael Parsons, is what are the Pharisees doing in the grain field? They just seem to pop up. It makes me think of the Pink Panther. He's sneaking around with a trench coat and dark glasses, and he's spying on Jesus. What are the Pharisees doing in the grain field? Nobody knows. Apparently, it's not important because Mark doesn't explain it either. But for some reason, they are already watching Jesus. If you read all of Mark chapter 2, there are 3 or 4 other for these two that we were studying today about conversations and controversies between Jesus and the Pharisees. So they're there, they're watching Jesus, and they're trying to find something that's wrong. They are the antagonists in the story. Jesus and his disciples are the protagonists. They're the good guys, and the Pharisees are the bad guys. We learn that right away in the Gospel of Mark. And that, according to scholars like Wendy Farley, is dangerous for us to read and not talk about. Because thinking that the Pharisees are evil and wicked leads to anti-Semitism. We might read the scripture and say, if it was true then, it's true now, and so therefore all Jewish people are like these people. And in the Gospels, we particularly see the Pharisees painted with this dark brush. We imagine them wearing black robes and having long beards and scowls. And then we imagine Jesus and the disciples looking a little bit more like this, a little ethereal, everything's in white, maybe a halo or two. And so we right away have this good and evil dichotomy going on. Just be aware that the Gospels paint a very dire picture of the Pharisees, and that we are reading the Gospels with that in mind. Those are the lenses that we have on when we're reading the Gospels. And there is quite a bit of new scholarship that supports the idea that the Pharisees were very good for their communities. They did a wonderful type of service in their communities. And so we have to be careful how we view them. So what did the Pharisees do in their communities? They were the lawyers. They were the experts in the law. They would look at a situation, and then they would look at the Mosaic law. And they would say, okay, is this person breaking the law? And they would practice something called binding and loosing. You might remember this from about 3 years ago when we first talked about it. When I was in Pentecostal church, binding and loosing only had to do with demons. We were supposed to bind demons and loose people from them. That's not what it's about at all. It's about the practice of weighing a situation against the law. And the Pharisees would decide if the law should be binding on that situation or whether they would loosen the law and give a little grace and understanding in a situation. So just for example, your neighbor has a statue of Mary in her garden, and every day you see her go out and she just touches the statue and she says a few words. And so you call up your neighborhood Pharisee and you say, oh, my neighbor is breaking the second commandment. She has a graven image in her garden and she prays to it and worships it every day, as neighbors do. And then the Pharisees would come and they would interview you and they would interview your neighbor and they would go see the statue and they would gather the information and they would say, okay, is this a graven image? Is she worshiping it? If she is, then yes, she's broken this commandment and we will have to hold her somehow responsible. She'll have to make an offering or a sacrifice and she'll have to stop doing that. But maybe this is just a garden ornament that was a gift given to her by her beloved daughter, and every day she goes out and prays a blessing for her daughter while she touches the statue. Oh, well then we can loose the command. It's not something binding on her. She's not breaking a commandment. That's what the Pharisees did for the people. They inherited this book of rules, and then they went through and sorted it out and applied it to everyday life. And they did that through dialogue. We'd have at least 10 rabbis in a minyan who would take each case and take it apart, look at it, consider it, talk about it, and it ended up being something called midrash, which is a collection of all the writings that these rabbis came up with in carefully considering the law. So that's what the Pharisees are doing here today in our reading. They're saying to Jesus, hey, your disciples are harvesting. Are they breaking the Sabbath commandment? They're asking for the dialogue, for the conversation. Let's consider this. Are the disciples breaking a rule or not? Do we bind it or do we loose it? This is what Pharisees do, but the way that it's painted in the Gospels and the way that we read it, already knowing what's going to happen to Jesus at the end of this book, we see them as antagonistic. We see them as picking on Jesus. So that's another problem that I see with this text. We have Pharisees popping up in a grain field where they shouldn't be, and then we have them painted as these very evil characters when they're actually just doing their job. The third problem comes with Jesus' answer. Jesus says, hey, don't you remember when David was hungry and he went to the tent of meeting and he got the consecrated bread and ate it? Jesus gets the story wrong. If you go to 1 Samuel chapter 21, you can read the story about David for yourself. Jesus tells the Pharisees in our reading today that David went to the priest Abiathar. That's not the priest. If you go back to the actual story, David goes to a priest named Ahimelech. Happens to be Abiathar's father, but it is a different person. And David goes alone, and Jesus specifically says here today that he was with his companions. So Jesus doesn't have all the facts on the story that he is using as part of his dialogue with the Pharisees. And some scholars suggest that if this actually happened this way, the Pharisees would have laughed and they would have said, we don't have to worry about this guy. He doesn't even know the Bible, or rather the scriptures. He doesn't know the history. He's not going to be a problem. He doesn't even remember how the story goes. But they don't do that. They take him seriously. So if you have a study Bible and you look at the footnotes will say, oopsie, there's a mistake here. Jesus has the wrong name for the priest. It must be a scribal error. Some scribe back, who knows when, made a mistake and put the wrong name in. I don't know. Either Jesus made a mistake, or the author of Mark's gospel made a mistake, or a scribe made a mistake. But however it happened, I don't think we can ever say the Bible's inerrant. You've got one mistake right here. Now, Jesus tells this story even though it really doesn't tie in a lot to the Sabbath, but it simply focuses on people's needs. Jesus puts the needs of his disciples ahead of the law about the Sabbath. And that leads us to another problem. The Pharisees would agree with him. When Jesus said, man was not created for the Sabbath was created for humanity, the Pharisees would have said, yep, you're right. That's what they did. They would not have responded the way that they do here, but they have to for the purpose that Mark has in mind to get us to this crucifixion of Jesus. So I just want you to read this text with an open mind, with curiosity, with questions, and say, okay, I don't think it could have really unfolded this way. There is something here that doesn't make sense. Now let's talk just for a minute about the bread that David eats. In the tabernacle, which was the forerunner of the temple. So let's say before this church was built, there was another building, right? The tabernacle is that other place. It's a tent. There's no place to go to worship and to offer sacrifice except this tent of meeting. And that's where the priest Ahimelech is. There's a table in the tent, and on it there are always 12 loaves of bread. The bread represents each of the tribes of Israel. And it's there 24/7. On the Sabbath, the bread is taken away. The priests are able to eat it, only the priests, and fresh loaves are put there. The reason is to celebrate and thank God for provision, to remember that there is always bread in God's house, that when you are hungry, when you are in need, God is always there to supply your need. And the bread was symbolic of that. So when David comes into this tent and says, I'm hungry, my men are hungry, do you have anything to eat? And the priest says, well, I've got a few loaves of this consecrated bread. We don't know if it's the fresh loaves or the old loaves, but it's only to be eaten by the priest. That's the law. So Jesus is showing that David and his companions, their hunger is more important than keeping this particular rule. Unfortunately, the people in the time of David and Ahimelech did not agree with that because Ahimelech lost his life for giving David the consecrated bread. When people broke the law of Moses, it wasn't like breaking a law for jaywalking on the street. It was breaking a law against God. You only sinned against God. You weren't sinning against other people. And Jesus is calling this, I think, into question. Is it sinning against God alone, or is not feeding someone who's hungry, who's right in front of you, is that breaking the law? So that's what this text is about. Now let's move on because there's so much more and we don't have a lot of time this morning. Jesus would say, yes, you always take care of the person in front of you. Linda Martin, who's calling attention to all the deaths of children in that sect, the followers of Christ, she is calling the law into question and saying person's needs need to be met first. And so are the Pharisees. The Pharisees would agree that a person's needs must be met first. Then we have an example of what that looks like. There is a man in the synagogue. Now we've gone from the grain field, now we're in the synagogue, and the Pharisees are where they should be. They're there. And there is a man there with a withered hand. And he is a wonderful example of what Jesus was trying to say in the earlier part of this text. This man does not ask for healing. He's standing somewhere in the synagogue, and Jesus calls him to come up front and center in front of everyone. Here is the need of a human being right in front of you. And then Jesus begins the dialogue with the Pharisees. Remember, in the grain field, the Pharisees begin the dialogue, but in the synagogue, Jesus begins the dialogue, and he says, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? To save life or to kill it? And no one answers. And Jesus becomes very angry. We don't see Jesus getting mad often in the Gospels, but he's angry here. Now, Linda Martin had a similar situation when later in life she found out that her brother, the father of the 2-year-old who died from untreated pneumonia, was in the hospital having heart surgery. So she went to the hospital to talk to him. And he was on pain medication, and he was being very well cared for. And she said to him, now that you know what medical care can do for you, if you had to do it all over again, would you get medical care for your child? And he said, no. And she said, why not? He said, well, because the elders of the church were praying for my son, and he was getting better. But they prayed for me, and I got worse. Linda was so angry and grief-stricken that he was so narrow-minded that he would get medical care when he did not do so for his own child. Jesus is the same way here. This is how he's feeling. He's asking the Pharisees a simple question. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? He wants them to say, of course it is, because that's what the Pharisees would have said. We always do good on the Sabbath. We always meet the need of the person on the Sabbath. That's never breaking the law. They know how to bind and loose the law. This would be a loosening of it. But they say nothing, and Jesus is angry and he's grief-stricken. The text says he is grieved because they did not enter into this dialogue, this conversation with him. As long as people are talking, there's hope. But in this case, there's no talking. Same with Linda and her brother. There was no more to say, and she never saw her brother again. I think what we need to remember here, well, let me back up. Let's finish the story. The best part is yet to come. The man with the hand has come forward. He has not asked for healing. And then Jesus does this is the best writing of Mark that I can find. Jesus does not pray for this man. He does not touch him. He says nothing. He does not say your sins are forgiven. He doesn't say a word except stretch out your hand. And as the man stretches his hand out, it's healed. And I can just see Jesus standing there saying, in his mind, to the Pharisees, I don't know how that happened. I didn't do anything. I'm just standing here keeping the Sabbath. Wink. It was funny. I see that it is lost on you. But it's a funny moment when Jesus is saying, hey, I don't know how that just happened because I'm just over here. I'm keeping the Sabbath like you all do. Anyway, let's move on. The important part about this text, and other scholars, I could name a bunch of them, John P. Meyer would agree, this is all about putting the human need in front of and ahead of the good of the institution, the good of the law. We don't want to support the law as a thing over the needs of the people, right? So Jesus shows that with this man. Linda Martin shows it by campaigning for the repeal of that religious shield law in Idaho. And we have the opportunity to do it here, but it all depends on one thing. It depends on dialogue. We must have dialogue around these issues or we cannot move forward. Now, in our nation today, wouldn't you agree that we don't have a lot of dialogue anymore? We have two sides who refuse to speak to one another, who cannot even be polite to one another, who are not working together at all, but are working at opposite ends of the spectrum. So we have lack of dialogue unfolding in our nation's capital, and it leads us to a place of no hope. Democracy has no hope if we can't have dialogue. But here, in this place, we have hope because we can have dialogue. We can talk to one another. And we are looking at a collaboration with another church. And when that happens and things change and you're feeling unhappy or uncomfortable, there's only one thing you can do, and that is talk to one another and to all of us, to have that open dialogue that Jesus is asking the Pharisees to have when the man with the withered hand is standing in front of him. And the only way you can have that dialogue is if you can see a vision beyond what we're arguing about or considering as we move forward. And so that leads to our question. The first question for your conversations today, for your dialogue with one another, is what are we here for? Why do we come together? Why do we do the work we do? What is the purpose? What makes us all come back here again and again and again? Whatever that is, that should guide us. So that when we come in here one day and the altar looks a little different because there's some Presbyterian items up here, or when you come in and somebody is sitting in your pew, or when the newsletter looks different, or when we change the name of the location to be more welcoming, all those things will bother you, I promise. And you must be able to talk about it. And I'm talking about everybody coming together. And that's why those groups that I asked you to sign up for are so important. If you want to be involved in the conversation, you have to join in. We can't make you talk. Jesus could not make the Pharisees talk. Linda Martin could not convince her brother to change the way he looked at things. But we invite you into that conversation. So I leave you with this question. What are we here for?